Hello, I am the author of this work. I wish to leave a foreword here before I begin so there are no misunderstandings with what I have done here. Now this tale I tell is mixed together through geological evidence, divination or soothsayer techniques used on past life or recessive memories, and fact-checked for at least the validity of the material extracted from past life accounts and legends of the ancient grimoire of both ancient occult sorcery and ancient Hebrew scripture. So do not take this as fact or a warping of any cultures, for it is derived by a combination of the available information to further the understanding of a history lost to us all, including myself. Thank you. We begin this tale by my descriptions of the Old Kingdom. This age that began, as far as I can tell from the gathered material, around 300 million years ago. This artifact is called the Bell of Calling. It was found in a layer of magma rock that carbon dates to being 300 million years old. And if you notice on the handle is an image of a great beast of destruction by their legends called by some, Doxodon Doxymedonian, the Behemoth, Tiamat, that old dragon, the Kraken, and also the Leviathan. The ancient antediluvian legend, which means pre-flood disaster in terminology, that has been gathered from various tombs cartouch images, says that there was a war just before the beginning of a great disaster that has confounded scientists as to what occurred in this time frame that caused the evolution of mankind's genetic step towards becoming the modern Homo sapien man they are today. It began somewhere around 40,000 years ago. This event is marked in legend to be called the Great Cataclysm. This event came in 3 stages of disaster. The first struck 74,000 years ago, that began with the eruption of the supervolcano Mount Tuba. The geologists mostly believe that this evolution of mammalian monkey was highly unintelligent and not very developed, but that is only because the artifacts they have discovered around this era were the ones developed and used after this global chain of catastrophes that wiped the entire world's population of mankind to less than a few thousand, and the once pristine cities that's remnants have been found, such as the Rigshaw Plateau in Africa that may have been the rumored Atlantis at one time, and the sunken temple of giants off the coast of Japan, who are said to have been a race of or as description would be best depicted as ogres, but also referred to in biblical scripture as Lagogites, who dwelled in the mountains of the north, and migrated along the Siberian steppes. They eventually became known as Scythians, or Stygians, or Nephilim as well. Now the memories that will tell the story have pinpointed the one central hub of all different cultures of life at that time to have been centered around a city only existing in legend and myth now. However, it was not a city, it was a unified kingdom once called Megiddo. In this era of Earth's history, the angels of heaven walked the earth with man, along with many other types of creatures. At this time dinosaurs still were present on the earth and are known in the Arcana Library Magic, or ancient tomes of magic, as the Ancient Ones, legendary creatures of immense size and appetite, and rumored to have the most vicious and horrific powers. It is said that the evil is so intense that no mortal could gaze upon their horrors in the light, for the sight would drive a person into insanity from which they would never return. There are also descriptions of these specific beasts' hunger that was said to need the constant daily diet of at least 50 to 100 people just to stay satisfied, and were rumored to lurk in the deepest caverns of the earth and the most remote locations deep in the jungles. These were the ancient remnants of the ones we call dinosaurs. The last ones ever seen was reported to be Dagon by the Babylonians around 6500 BC, which was what geologists call today a megalodon shark. Dagon was rumored to have only one weakness that could defeat him, and that was the horn of a unicorn, or by modern translation a creature that still exists today called narwhals. But then there is the one that is like the Godzilla of the ancient ones, a great beast said to fit the description of the Greek Kraken called the Leviathan, the Demiurge, Doxodon Doxymedonian. For the remainder of this tale we shall simply refer to it as the Demiurge. This beast had a creator, a Syrian magus who was once known as Malki, the necromancer, lord and guardian of the astral gateway of the eternal waters of life. In this era of history there was no true death. Dying was only a small obstacle and inconvenience, as one could be reborn into a new form if someone's body became too damaged to rejuvenate. When one died, their spirit or life's residual energy would be transferred into the astral realm by way of a sigil or symbol that each person born fresh from the soul spring would be given. The soul spring was the origin of all life upon the world. There were 3 places similar to the soul spring which regulated the flow of life in Astra, which was their expression that described existence or the universe. The first flow or river of Astra was of course the soul spring. Then there was the mana fount in Ethria. This place said to be somewhere deep in the earth somewhere, a place where all the flows of magical energy joined together and was the heart of the living entity of the earth itself, Eliane Om. Most referred to the mother goddess of the earth as Eliana. Then there was the flow of the Urulu, which later became associated to being called the River of Styx, but is most commonly associated to the astral realm. This realm was created by the Archonsages of Arcana, a council of sorcerers who saw over all the affairs of magic. They were at first a council of 5, one who dwelt in each of the 5 kingdoms. Megiddo was the 5th and last kingdom. The sages could transcend time and space. They were beyond death and ruled over the 5 kingdoms this way. They were the pinnacle of what was just and wise. As the kingdoms progressed, more members were added to the council until in the end there were 9 sages upon the council. In biblical scripture they were known as the Council of High Archangels: Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, Phanuel, Aziraphale, Chamuel, Malchal, Pidal, and Sariphanel. All was just and great from Elendiras, the citadel of the White Spire and center of all magic. Until the time of the Dark One, Golgothos, came to pass near the end of the kingdom of Megiddo. This civilization knew of its coming demise but could do nothing to stop the coming disaster that would end their entire civilization, even though they tried their best. Neared the end before the great conflict began, they tried calling upon the greatest and most powerful being in all of Astra, one who could alter the motion of the sky gods with the motion of his hands. What they got was Lucifer, the son of the morning star, bearer of the first dawn, the living incarnate of the flame of Astra, whom was the greatest warrior of the one that we now call God, who was referred to as the great invisible spirit, who was the ruler of the kingdom of the light. They beseeched the light warrior to save them from the coming destruction. However, the angelic warrior became focused on an event that had been overlooked by the council until it was too late, and the enemy had already taken form upon the earth and was rising that very moment. Across the earth beyond the great mountain of fire that separated the kingdom of Megiddo from shadow realm of the dead, that was the kingdom of the Urulu, ruled by Malkiel the astral guardian, who ensured everyone who perished and was drawn into his domain would find their path back to the realm of the living. His realm was like a safety net that would catch the spirits of the dead and cause them to linger between the living world and the great chasm of oblivion which led into the vortex of the energy that all things slowly were drawn towards. For none who fell into the chasm of oblivion ever returned, and so his domain was placed to snatch all who fall in towards it and would place them safely somewhere in Astra. One day, they say, a great and all-consuming darkness latched on to the mind of Malkiel. It twisted his thoughts to become consumed with hatred and contempt. Then the dark evil within his mind took the form of the evil one, Golgothos. Neither living or dead, for it had never lived. It was like a living shadow of all that was wrong and cruel. Every angry thought or word ever spoken, every bad deed was seemingly given its own life and form that was in nature, astral-based, and so Malkiel was the first to encounter this shadow entity that later became known as Nazgul, or evil shadow spirit, which later became known as a shade. The Dark One convinced Malkiel to forge the Stones of Power, 3 stones of immense arcane power that together held the ability to bend the very fabrics of reality to the holder's will. Malkiel had heard rumor of a legend of a star that fell from the skies long ago in the Third Kingdom. The shards of this star were said to be very powerful, and the other objects of mystical power, such as the Firestone, the mystical Eye of Edom, and the Chaos Rune stones known as the World Stones of Arat, were all said to have been forged from the shards of this star. This fallen star was the remnants of the asteroid that had killed the dinosaurs that struck the Earth 65 million years ago and ended the world of the Ancient Ones and drove them into the Earth to dwell in the darkness. The records of the Third Kingdom state that the fallen star had come from the galaxy we now call Orion and struck the southernmost region of the Earth, and when it did, it shattered into many pieces and scattered themselves to all the corners of the Earth. These pieces became known as what we now call lodestones, but it also brought with it a terrible sickness. It was said that once the shards had been smelted and purified, then it was safe to hold, but until then, any who held or possessed the raw stone was doomed to a fate of death. Some even say that in some cases it caused an effect of being unable to die, a type of a zombie-like curse whose effects seem to be very similar in description to that of what we now call the flesh-eating bacteria and staph infection. So very carefully Malkiel gathered the purification materials and forged the stones of power. One was called the Soul Stone and by itself held the power to give its wielder the knowledge of time and space and granted them immortality. The second stone was the Celestial Stone that gave the holder the ability to travel across dimensions and take the form of other objects, and because of this it was also called the Stone of Transmutation. The third stone was called the Crescent Moon Stone and it held the power to bring one's thoughts and dreams into reality. Together the power of these three stones could be compared to that of Thanos and the Infinity Gauntlet. Realizing this terrorizing too late, they asked the Light Warrior what could be done to stop this threat. The Light Warrior then forged a mystical weapon from the very fabrics of light itself, the Sword of Spirits. Its blade never dulled and could not be broken. The wielder of the sword would be granted the skills of a great sword master. Within the handguard were 4 mystical rune stones that gave the holder command of the 6 elements of Astra: air, earth, fire, water, light and darkness. The sages had never considered the 2 new additions to the elemental chain, but they saw the wisdom in it and adapted the Light Warrior's gift into expanding their mystical craft. The sages questioned whether this weapon would be enough to stand against such power as the stones, and the Light Warrior replied that it was not made to contend with the power of the stones. The holder of such power may not answer to the laws of reality, but the earth he stood on would. The Light Warrior also had made the sword to only be held by one individual and placed the sword in a stone pedestal, and it could only be pulled free by the one whom the Light Warrior had foreseen to be capable of defeating the holder of the stones. Only in his hands could the sword be freed and held. In any other's hands it would bear the weight of a boulder. To find the one worthy of this sword, the Light Warrior created the Book of the Dead, the Necronomicon, that possessed the spirits of their ancestors who would measure the heart of the one who tried to free the sword. They would test him for valor, wisdom and courage to see if he was the warrior meant for the sword. However, while the Light Warrior was on his way to search for the proper place to keep the sword hidden until the appointed time, he stumbled across a very arrogant little boy. The boy tried to steal an object from his bag that was to be a gift to the king of Megiddo, the gift of music. He had crafted a small lute as well as a piccolo from some river reed grass and string. The arrogant boy tried to steal the piccolo while he wasn't paying attention and then lied about it when he asked him where it went. Short on patience with such foolishness, the traveler revealed himself to be a powerful sorcerer and cursed the boy. Since the boy wanted to act like a little beast, then a little beast he shall be. And he turned the boy into a half-man half-goat and said that he shall be cursed to live on the forest with the other animals, for if he tried to go into town they would chase him off as though he were a monster, and the Light Warrior told him he could keep the piccolo since he now had paid for it. The Light Warrior also cursed him with immortality and said that time will pass until all you know will have returned to the dust of the earth, and the village you once lived in will be reclaimed by the forest, but you shall not. You shall live to see all you know vanish in the winds of time, for you will not die. You shall be immortal and live through the countless eons until you absolve yourself of your spoiled ways. So thus was the origin of the one you call Pan, for the Light Warrior knew of the sins this boy would commit through the ages and how he would refuse to change his ways, and so brought down the full weight of payment for his crimes right then and there. Now we shall begin the prequel to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the beginning of the end of the old kingdom once called Megiddo. The 9 sages had gathered to discuss the rising darkness that had begun tainting the lands. As the sages gathered to discuss the situation, the elven ones, the sons of the earth and priests of Aliana, suddenly began to disappear. One by one the elven cities became abandoned, the occupants nowhere to be found, and rumor had begun to spread that they had begun migrating in large numbers in the shadows of the night, hiding their movement as if avoiding some impending threat. Not even their mortal adversaries, the ogres, knew where or why they had left. Only that it was said they were heading northeast past the Great Lake and into the northernmost mountain territory. The fairy kind had heard they were relocating to the sacred caverns of a distant ally to the Earth Mother Goddess that was said to be some mystical sages who were part man and part fish that dwelt within secret hidden caverns within the mountains. The sages were greatly offended that in the kingdom's greatest hour of need they chose to run than to stand by them to fight for their way of life. It also began to be said in rumor that one of the reasons they left was because of the coming cataclysm. However, the elven shaman had known of this coming disaster as long as they had. Why would they decide to run now? A very few elves who had remained feeling bound by honor had said that the elders stated that there was more to the cataclysm than they realized, and there was no way to stop the disaster that was coming. The generals of Megiddo felt devastated by the loss of the elven shaman. The fairy had an immense sway over the mystical energies, and the mortal sages of mankind had a profound capacity to understand that arcana magic, but it was the elven shaman who held the power of the seeing eye. Without them they would have to walk blindly into battle against an enemy they did not even have the ability to see coming until they were on the horizon. Malkiel reveled in satisfaction. It was unfolding just as his master Golgothos had said it would. They would never see him coming, and the new magical craft he had been perfecting in secrecy assured they remained clouded by the new power of the dark arts he had designed from the revelation the Light Warrior had brought to them. Every time one of the sages would try and seek answers from this new element of shadow, something would envelope their magics and consume their ability to see any details. Then they began to hear reports of something beyond the great mountain that stirred the fear of the ogres and goblins that dwelt there. They began hearing tales of nightmarish creatures attacking the goblin enclaves, and the ogres' city of Dor fell silent within a single night. The entire town of ogres had vanished overnight with no sign of a fight. As if they had just vanished in the night. Before the Council of Megiddo could begin to assess the situation arising and realize that if something was not done soon, the goblins and ogres would side with this new threat if it proved to be powerful enough to succeed in their goal, whatever it may be, for they knew not even what that was. Almost as if in response to their fears over the peaks of the great mountain, hordes of ogre, goblin and sinister creatures that seemed as though they were of the ancient ones but smaller than the ones of legend, but still ferocious and deadly as the ancients nonetheless. These beasts that many came to call in scripture, demons, but by modern translation of the old myths they were better known as dragons, appeared. They came in waves of countless numbers, and their leader was a sorcerer whose power had never been seen before. He not only commanded the very shadows that would take form right before them and would become one of his dragon minions right there by his command, but he also held power over the spiritual energies. The sages tried to reach Malkiel to find out what this was rising from out of his kingdom, but they got no reply and believed him to have perished at the hands of this rising darkness. The dwarven kind who lived atop the great mountain had to flee their homeland as the ogres and goblins overwhelmed the mighty Fudgemasters. These dwarven kind were once known as giants among men and could pick up an entire boulder and hurl it at an enemy. It is how they claimed ownership of their kingdom atop the great mountain, for none could contest their claim without being smashed by a flying boulder. Now here were the mighty giants running from the mountains, fleeing for their lives from the enemy many had not yet even seen, for they stayed out of open sight and hidden within the mountains. The dwarven giants brought tales of rampaging goblins and ogres, but even worse was the report that somewhere in those mountains was a great beast like that of the ancient ones of old. They called this great beast that seemed to be the king of the dragons, Tiamat, pronounced Tiamo, and the Dark Sorcerer, the fairy had come to call Sudas, which meant Dark Sage in their language. The fairy spoke of the power they had heard the Dark Sorcerer possessed and told the sages of the 3 stones he had fastened to a covering of metal that fit over him, protecting him from any projectiles. But the 3 glowing orbs that he had fastened onto this protective covering was the most dangerous part. It seemed as though the magic energies would beckon to his very will and spells would be cast without him making any motion of conjuring or even speaking any words of incantations. The magic would just sweep from him and across the battlefield, decimating any within his path. The sages called upon Lucifer to help them and defend them against this powerful nemesis. Their warrior of the light asked permission of the king to take leave from the city to go and retrieve the chosen warrior, the wielder of the spirit sword. Reluctant, the king gave him permission and begged him a swift journey. Off Lucifer rushed to acquire the chosen one while the sages prepared for the advancing armies of suitors. The leaders and ones of great might and mind of each of the kingdoms came together to plan out their strategy. They first sent a combined army of all the kingdoms to defend the border of the advancing army of suitors at the base of the mountain near what is now Thailand and Tibet. The just beyond those regions today was once the kingdom of the fairy kind, but just as the defenders arrived, the entire city of Median, the capital of the fairy kingdom, had caught fire and burned to the ground in a single night. Another kingdom fallen in a single night. First the kingdom of the ogres, then the dwarven giants, now the fairy kind's kingdom had fallen and the elven ones had disappeared still without a trace. The dwarven men had planned a rear assault into Malkiel's kingdom, but to do so would mean they would have to journey west into the lands of Exodus to achieve this. This land, which is now known as North America, was home to the exiles, those so dangerous and vile that they were banished to this land that was, and had always been for some unknown reason, barren and devoid of any sustainable life. No trees or fruit-bearing plants would grow there. The soil was brittle and without nutrients, so that vegetation would not grow. Everything upon that region of land was desolate, and so they sent the worst of their kingdom there to rot and die. On the other side of the land of exile was an entrance into the kingdom of the dead. Malkiel's kingdom was named the lands of the dead because any who ventured into this region would mysteriously die, no matter how strong or skilled they were, and even the most powerful sorcerers had a hard time crossing this land. Only now in our era do I see the reasons why, though. One of the legendary places found in this region were the 9 mountains of the ancient Arcana Magus, the first sorcerers who rose from the flames within the mountains and were said to have been forged by the great invisible spirit formed the very fires within. These mountains were volcanoes that were said to be constantly erupting and rarely went silent. Supposedly this region was the last of the Earth's surface to cool and solidify from its early molten state, and the 9 volcanoes that are now called the Ring of Fire were spots that never actually completely cooled and stayed permanently in a state of eruption because of this, and nestled between 2 of those volcanic mountains was the fortress of Malkiel, the Necromancer Lord as he later became known as, or Sudas by Hindu accounts. The Hebrew texts refer to him as the enemy of all the kingdoms of the earth who ruled the lands of the dead, beyond the Valley of Shadows, in the time of the old kingdom of those who came before us. They were very descriptive when naming him, it seems. Only now in our age of science and reasoning do I see why none could enter this land and live. It was because of the constant saturation of volcanic gases emitted by the 9 volcanoes that blanketed the air of this region with poisonous sulfuric gases. The region that led from the land of Exodus and into the lands of the dead was through a valley passage that was very well known even today as the Valley of Shadows. It begins right off the coast of what is today Malibu, California, and stretches right down along the ocean floor and ends some 280 miles heading straight west into the Pacific Ocean. It was once said that once you reached past this point, there was no turning back. For if you were not dead by the time you reached there, then you would be soon, for none but the dead may cross the Valley of Shadows, and the dead do not give pity to the living who trespass into their lands, for none living has ever returned to tell of what lies beyond. Now I shall take a break from the story for a moment here to explain what some viewers may be curious of. that many details of this legend seem to coincide with portions of the Lord of the Rings saga. You're right, it does, for this is the very same legend that J.R.R. Tolkien had derived a majority of the tale that he wrote the Lord of the Rings saga from, only this version is more complete for one and has not been mixed with other legends strictly for the sake of monetization reasons. There were other legends he included for just such reasons, such as the Norse legend of the Ring of Adavari and others, but this tale is the actual myth behind the movie. You can also find some accounts and portions of this legend in the Hindu texts of the Mahabharata and the tale of the Battle of the Ten Kings for small reference tales involving Sudas and the rise against him, but it is very hard to translate it into a sensible account due to the fact that, like the tale of Noah's flood, it is a tale that was passed down through generations before being recorded finally onto tablets. So much of the story was lost either in translation between languages or in transcription to stone records. However, many cultures have similar stories, all pointing to a distant event in their culture's ancient past, and if you tie the similar events from one culture to another and backstep to verify the time frame of the legend's origins, you may stumble onto the same tale I am telling you now, just as J.R.R. Tolkien had attempted to do. Also, another footnote is that there are also many Fae legends that coincide with these tales as well. Not surprisingly though, for as I understand it, many of the older Hindu gods were in fact those of the Fae. It is rumored that if backed into a corner and threatened, the Fae have the ability to suddenly grow in size to that of a human, if not bigger, but the blue skin from the deep saturation of the mystical energy would still be present, so that the end result of one of the Fae who feel threatened and scared would look like those described to be that of the Hindu gods.